It was a dark and stormy night when Mark, a nurse on duty at St. Jude Hospital, began his nightly routine. The storm raged outside, throwing intermittent lightning that illuminated the hospital in a ghostly manner. St. Jude Hospital was an imposing, ancient facility known for its history of quality medical treatment. But, like all hospitals, it had its dark side. Mark had always heard stories about how scary hospitals were at night, but he was a practical man, not inclined to superstition. He was there to care for patients and make his rounds, regardless of the weather or time of day. That night, the hospital was unusually quiet. The inpatient unit was almost empty, with only a few patients occupying the rooms. Mark knew the night shift would be dull and silent, but he was prepared for it. However, as he began his rounds, something seemed out of place. As he walked through the empty hallways, he began to notice strange sounds. Creaks, murmurs, and distant whispers that echoed in the dark corridors. He tried to chalk them up to normal hospital noises, like water running in the pipes or the wind howling outside, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Mark walked past the intensive care ward, where the heart monitors hummed softly. He checked on the patients. Everyone seemed calm, but the atmosphere was heavy. An elderly patient, Mr. Johnson, was restless and appeared distraught. He mumbled unintelligible words, staring blankly into the corner of the room, as if he saw something Mark couldn't. Mark tried to calm Mr. Johnson by checking his vitals and adjusting the sheets. However, the elderly man looked terrified and repeated the same incoherent words. Mark was starting to feel uncomfortable and tried to call a doctor to check on the patient, but no one was answering the phone. As Mark continued his rounds, the feeling that something dark was lurking intensified. He decided to check the psychiatric ward, where the most unstable patients were treated. As he entered the ward, the smell of disinfectant and the heavy atmosphere enveloped him. That place always made him uncomfortable. As he walked through the halls of the psychiatric ward, Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. He heard low laughter and moans that seemed to come from the patient's cells. However, upon inspecting them, he saw that they were empty. No patients were present, but the sounds continued, as if echoing through the corridors. The storm outside roared louder, and the electricity failed, plunging the hospital into total darkness. Mark turned on his flashlight and hurried back to the main hallway, where a shadowy figure appeared to be standing at the end of the hallway. He blinked his eyes several times, thinking that his mind was playing tricks on him due to the sudden darkness. However, the figure was there, still and motionless. Mark shouted for the person to identify themselves, but there was no response. He took a few unsteady steps toward the figure, and then the electricity returned, lighting up the hallway. The figure had disappeared. Mark felt like he had lost his sanity. What had he seen? Was it just the result of exhaustion and stress, or was something more sinister going on at St. Jude Hospital? He knew the answer could only be found as the night unfolded. Mark couldn't get his encounter with the shadowy figure in the hallway out of his mind. He knew something was wrong at St. Jude Hospital, something beyond his rational understanding. As the storm continued to rage outside, he decided to investigate the hospital's history for clues that could explain what was happening. St. Jude Hospital was a prestigious location in the community, known for its history of quality medical care. However, like all places, it had a dark past that few knew about. Mark began digging through the hospital's archives and talking to some of the older staff to find out more about its history. He discovered that decades ago, the hospital was a sanatorium that treated mentally ill patients. Some of the accounts of the treatment these patients received were terrifying. Psychiatric procedures at the time were, in many cases, inhumane and cruel. Mark found evidence of shock treatments, lobotomies, and solitary confinement. He also found references to a doctor named Dr. Richard Langley, who was a controversial figure in the hospital's history. Dr. Langley was known for his controversial medical practices and testing risky procedures on patients without proper consent. Furthermore, he was accused of carrying out unethical experiments in search of medical advances. The most terrifying story Mark uncovered was related to a patient named Emily. She was young and had been admitted to hospital after a nervous breakdown. The reports of what happened to Emily were disturbing. She was said to have died mysteriously while under Dr. Langley's care. Whispers about his death circulated, claiming that something supernatural was involved. Furthermore, Mark discovered that the hospital was built on top of an old Indian cemetery. Many believed the site was cursed, and exorcism rituals were performed to purify the land, but nothing seemed to work. With all this disturbing information in mind, Mark began to believe that the hospital was haunted by events from the dark past. The shadowy figures, unsettling sounds, and inexplicable presence seemed to be related to the disturbing legacy of St. Jude Hospital. He decided to share his findings with a colleague, Dr. Sarah Collins. Dr. Collins was a doctor who was skeptical of paranormal phenomena and had a scientific approach to everything. However, when Mark showed her the evidence he had found, she began to reconsider her position. Dr. Collins was intrigued by the hospital's history and agreed to help Mark investigate further. Together, they planned to spend an entire night at St. Jude Hospital, using ghost-detecting equipment and cameras to capture any evidence of the supernatural. Little did they know that this decision would lead them to face horrors they could never have imagined. As night approached, the storm continued to batter the hospital, adding an ominous touch to the already heavy atmosphere. Mark and Dr. Collins were determined to find out what was happening and find answers to the inexplicable events they had witnessed up to that point. However, what came next was beyond anything they could have predicted. The night of Mark and Dr. Collins' investigation has finally arrived. As the storm raged outside, they prepared for a night of searching and exploring at St. Jude Hospital. With an array of ghost detection equipment, cameras, and flashlights, they were ready to face the unknown. The research team began their investigation in the psychiatric ward, where Mark had previously captured the strange sounds. The atmosphere in that part of the hospital was even thicker in the darkness of the night. As they walked through the halls, Dr. Collins carried a voice recorder to capture any unexplained noises or voices. The first signs of paranormal activity did not take long to appear. Unexplained noises, whispering voices, and the sounds of footsteps were recorded on the recordings. Dr. Collins was surprised and intrigued by the amount of evidence they were collecting. The team continued to explore the cells where the most unstable patients tended to stay. Mark's flashlight swept the empty cells, while Dr. Collins kept the voice recorder activated. The sounds seemed to get louder as they went deeper into the ward. Wails, distorted laughter, and incoherent words echoed off the walls. In one of the cells, the team noticed a shadowy, nondescript figure captured in Dr. Collins' camera footage. It was a silhouette that appeared to be looking directly at the camera, although it had no clear facial features. Mark and Dr. Collins were petrified as the figure seemed to be watching them. Dr. Collins took several photos, trying to capture the figure from different angles, but it remained elusive and menacing. The ghost detection equipment also started to go crazy. The lights flickered, the temperatures dropped sharply, and the paranormal activity meter pointed to peak levels. The team felt surrounded by an inexplicable presence. At that moment, the shadowy figure they had captured in the images seemed to materialize before them. It was the image of a woman, her face contorted in suffering. She appeared to be patient Emily, whose mysterious death was linked to the hospital's history. Dr. Collins, who was skeptical of the paranormal, was in a state of shock. She now believed that the hospital was truly haunted. Mark, on the other hand, felt a surge of determination. They needed to understand what was happening and help the tormented souls who seemed to be trapped in the hospital. Emily's figure remained in the cell, as if begging for help. Mark and Dr. Collins decided to approach with caution. As they approached, they could hear the woman's silent crying. She raised her hand as if to touch them, but then disappeared abruptly, like a candle blown out by the wind. The research team was stunned. They had witnessed a paranormal apparition that went beyond any scientific explanation. Mark and Dr. Collins knew they needed to document this discovery and find a way to help the tormented souls who seemed to be trapped in the hospital. Together, they continued their investigation, determined to reveal the truth and free the hospital from the dark past that haunted it. However, they were about to face even more terrifying events as the night of the apparitions continued. What they would discover next was something that would defy all laws of science and the supernatural. As the night of apparitions continued, Mark and Dr. Collins got closer and closer to the dark truth plaguing St. Jude Hospital. They had witnessed disturbing paranormal apparitions and discovered a history of abuse and cruel experiments that had occurred decades ago. Now, they were determined to find a way to help the tormented souls who seemed to be trapped in the hospital. The research team continued exploring the areas of the hospital where they had captured the apparitions. The evidence of paranormal activity was undeniable. Strange sounds, whispering voices, and unsettling shadows continued to haunt them. They knew they had to find a way to communicate with the entities and understand what kept them tied to the hospital. In a room in the hospital's basement, Mark and Dr. Collins decided to hold a spirit communication session. They lit candles, organized their voice recordings, and prepared to ask questions of the entities haunting the place. "If there is anyone here," Mark began, his voice shaking slightly, "please come forward and tell us what you want." For a moment, silence dominated the room. Then, the temperature dropped drastically, sending shivers up Mark and Dr. Collins' spines. A whispering voice began to echo in the room, a voice that sounded like it was a woman's. "Emily, Freedom, help me," the voice murmured, desperate. Mark and Dr. Collins felt they were in direct contact with the soul of Emily, the patient whose mysterious death was tied to the hospital's history. They kept asking questions, trying to understand why she was trapped. Emily revealed that she died at the hands of Dr. Langley, the hospital's controversial doctor, during an experimental lobotomy that went horribly wrong. She felt lost and traumatized, unable to move on. Determined to help Emily and the other tormented souls, Mark and Dr. Collins continued the communication session. Other voices began to join the conversation, revealing similar stories of suffering and torment. It seemed that many patients from the past were still stuck in that place, unable to find peace. Mark and Dr. Collins decided to perform an exorcism ritual to try to free the trapped souls. They found instructions in an old book that was kept in the hospital library, detailing the exorcism process. They had no experience in this type of ritual, but they were willing to try anything to help the tormented souls. However, once they began the ritual, things quickly got out of control. The room became even colder, the candles shook violently, and the entities' voices became more aggressive. The atmosphere became oppressively heavy, as if the hospital itself was resisting the exorcism attempt. Mark and Dr. Collins began to feel dizzy and weak. They struggled to continue the ritual, but the power of the entities was overwhelming. That's when Mark realized that the ritual was only making the situation worse. They had released negative energy that was out of control. In a last-ditch effort, Mark ordered the ritual to stop, and slowly the voices and pressure in the room began to ease. The storm outside began to subside, as if the sky itself was responding to what was happening inside the hospital. Mark and Dr. Collins knew they couldn't release the trapped souls that night. They needed specialized help to deal with the situation. However, before leaving the hospital, they recorded an apologetic message to the entities, promising that they would return with help. As they left St. Jude Hospital, a sense of relief and overwhelm mixed together. They knew they had tapped into something much bigger than themselves. The hospital's dark history and the tormented souls that still roamed the halls were a mystery that would only be solved with the help of experts in paranormal activity. Mark and Dr. Collins left the hospital that night, determined to go back and face whatever was haunting St. Jude Hospital. They had witnessed the horror of the past and knew that the search for the truth was just the beginning of a journey that would lead them to face even more terrifying and unknown events